Hi, I'm Andy Murray. Welcome to It's a Customer's World podcast. Now more than ever, retailers and brands are accelerating their quest to be more customer-centric. But to be truly customer-centric, it requires both a shift in mindset and ways of working, not just in marketing, but in all parts of the organization. In this podcast series, I'll be talking with practitioners, thought leaders, and scholars to hear their thoughts on what it takes to be a leader in today's customer-centric world. Hello, everyone. In this episode, we'll be focusing on some of the strategic challenges CPGs face as they adapt to the transformation retail media networks are having on their business. To delve into that subject, I was delighted to have Ms. Kelly Downey join me on the podcast. Kelly is a strategic consultant at Oxford SM. She has 30 years of CPG experience delivering strong outcomes in senior level roles, including field and headquarter sales, trade planning, shopper marketing, digital, and agile transformation. She's worked in leadership positions driving change at well-known CPGs such as Kraft, Unilever, and Philips. I met Kelly at a Path to Purchase Institute Leadership Share Group session, and it was clear to me her industry perspective would help shed some light on how companies are navigating change. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Hello, Kelly, and welcome to the podcast. I'd like to start with you telling us a bit about your journey and what has led you up to the point that you're doing now.
Sure. Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. So a bit of a long journey in the industry. Started as a sales rep at General Foods, carrying the bag, as we like to say, and worked at General Foods, which became Kraft Foods, for about 21 years through a whole host of sales positions, trade marketing, so running the trade budgets, but also to include running our corporate calendar and our consumer promotion department for Kraft Foods North America. So that was really exciting, and was looking to stay a little closer to home than traveling to Chicago as often as I did. So moved over to Unilever and spent about 8 years there. First running shopper marketing. We called it Building Brands with Customers before we changed the name to shopper marketing. And then I ran the trade budget for Unilever US, and ultimately went back into a field selling position running what we called strategic growth channels. So everything, sorry to say this, Andy, with the exception of Walmart, that was Jim Breach, who you may know, and grocery. So I had sort of all others, and really there cut my teeth on e-commerce because a little customer named Amazon fell into my lap. So really good learning grounds, that is 12 or more years ago. And then moved over to Philips North America to run digital and marketing operations there, and finished my kind of full-time career back at Unilever running a digital transformation project. And now I consult for Oxford SM, and that's been really exciting over the past 3 years, getting to sort of not only use my experience, but learn about a whole other bunch of categories, industries, and approaches, both from the sales and marketing side of things.
Wow. Well, of course, I love your shopper marketing background, being a fellow journeyer in that space. And also, I'm really excited to talk more about how you see things because of your commercial background. There are a number of podcasts out there right now covering retail media networks, and rightly so, given the fast evolution and big shifts in spending. But most are coming at it through a media lens or just simply covering the latest new offerings, which, to be honest, can be kind of hard to keep up with. So today I wanted to, especially with your background, look at it through the lens of a more senior leadership level inside of CPG specifically, and then also through the lens of what a shopper marketer might be seeing in more of a commercial lens, which I don't think we hear enough about what's happening in that space from an impact standpoint. I know you facilitate a number of senior level share groups for brands as part of Oxford and the things that you're doing. But without getting any specific company, what are some of the themes that you're consistently seeing pop up around this area of retail media networks?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it is the talk of the town. I mean, we spend an awful lot of our time talking about things like um, how do we measure? Of course, there's no consistency there. Where do the budgets sit for this?
Hmm.
Where do the skill sets sit? And who sort of strategically plans and executes it? Do we need to reorganize because of this? I mean, and it's fascinating to me in many ways. And you and I have been in
Yeah.
many of these roles. I understand why those topics come up, but on the flip side, I started like getting concerned. Like, guys, it's a tactic.
Hmm.
It isn't in and of itself a strategy, um, b really a department. So, and
Yeah.
so I think it's kind of like in a smaller sense when e-commerce emerged, and rightfully so, that was very different, and organizations began to structure around that, and there were nuances to it and ways to look at it very differently. But what happens is you begin to sort of segregate pieces of your strategy, your plan, your dollars, your people, and you start to really lose a bigger picture, I
Hmm.
think, at times, and probably become pretty inefficient because you're not looking at spend resources in a holistic way to drive your ultimate business goals. It tends to be a little bit more ad hoc if you're not careful, or sort of, and the thing becomes the work.
Yeah, 100%. And do you think that's because it's it's so much more complexity involved? You've got to have some mastery involved there. So it's almost like let's just set it over here as a new thing, and then all of a sudden it can grow like what happened with e-commerce, right? Where you lose the bigger picture of omni-channel when you start
Yes.
segmenting it. But I mean, is that kind of where you see it as that people are probably looking at it through the lens of this is a specialized competency for us to go anywhere, we've got to get there, versus saying we understand it completely and it really should sit strategically over here?
Right. No, I think it's very true. When you talked early in the chat here about, how do senior leaders think about this? And some of the watchouts, and in fairness to all of us who've been in those roles, when new things come along, you sort of like, oh yeah, let's dabble in that a little bit. Who knows it? Let's empower them to some degree. Maybe they test and learn some things. And that's all well and good. And I think what's happened in this case is, number one, there is a lot of specialization. So when you think about retailer search, display ads, all the different elements that kind of are popping up, this is not something, you heard my background. I've been doing this a really long time.
Yeah.
I started before stores had scanners, in
Yeah.
in
Love it.
some ways. So, when Nielsen data came up, I'd be like, I'm a salesperson. What the hell do I need to know about Nielsen data? Like,
Hmm.
who cares who buys it as long as we get it into the
That's right.
warehouse?
Exactly.
And so I remember being really offended that marketers were getting their heads wrapped around this Nielsen data and telling me things about my customers.
Hmm. Yeah.
So guess what? I had to start to learn enough. I didn't have to manipulate the data myself, but I had to learn enough so that I really was a part of the conversation and not on the outside looking in. The same holds true for retail media networks. And I think what happens is you bring in specialized talent, which you do need to have. They either come from agencies or they come from the retailers, or some of them obviously have third parties that they work with, and they come with a skill set so important. They don't come with a full picture of what you're trying to do as a manufacturer, a brand, a category. And so you can, if you're not careful, you end up just sort of buying tactics that really have nothing to do with what your end game is. So I think a senior leader, I was, talking about this kind of reverse mentoring. You owe the people who execute these things you don't have experience with really clear brief about what your mission is, what you're trying to do, what KPIs you're going to measure, which, by the way, happen to have things like sales, volume, profit, share, not just click through rates or whatever. And on the flip side, you as sort of a specialist need to explain or help senior leaders understand what these tactics can and can't do.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. And it does feel to me like we are at an inflection point. Very recently, I suppose I would say, with the CPG world, the suppliers, because I do think probably the last couple of years, it's been just be able to execute the tactics. You've got, the COVID hit and you had, massive shifts in online and just execute, was where I think the industry was. But now the developmental nature is starting to pull back a bit and the bigger strategic questions are starting to come into play like I didn't see being asked a year ago. Are you seeing that as kind of now this more of I don't want to call it an epiphany, but an awareness that, wait a minute, we've got to work out quite a bit of what this means because you're talking massive shifts in money, accountability, and these are all really bubbling pretty recently.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's 100%. There's this gap that was, formed with the pandemic and everything that went on with COVID. But additionally, and you're right, people are just like, get it done, whatever it takes, blah, 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 blah. And now what's happening is, to your point, so much money is going into this space. I don't think there's a client I haven't talked to that isn't struggling to sort of hit their goals, make their P&L work for them with all the inflationary issues, the slowdown in consumption in certain categories. And so suddenly, it's like anything. When things get tough, the screws just get turned, and all of a sudden everything's up for debate and discussion. And I think when you sort of pull back the curtain, people are sort of like, well, wait a second, who's making these decisions?
Right.
Oh, I mean, wait, like, and who's overlooking like how this overlaps with other oh, maybe nobody, or maybe not the right people, or you know what, maybe we're doing super well, we should be doing more of it and we didn't realize it. I mean,
Yep.
and I think there when you step all the way back, I think what organizations need to get really clear. It starts at the very top, and it starts with some very concise statements around what are our goals, what are we trying to achieve, and what role do these various tactics, RMNs being a big one of them, play in delivering those objectives. And then who and how are we going to get that done?
Yep.
How do we measure it? How frequently? And understanding, I mean, I was teasing about the Nielsen data, but it isn't wrong. Over time we've had gaps in data our whole lives. And it's like, well, what can we trust? What will we believe? What will we test? What are we willing to spend? And those are discussions that, if that is clear with organizations, you can empower people to go and execute. But when that's unclear, and that's what I'm concerned about, is it's kind of like, when Facebook came along or whatever, people ran around, we need a Facebook page.
Yep.
Well, why? Why? Oh, because it's the new thing. I mean, all right, who's our consumer? Is our consumer even engaging with this platform? Oh, well, I don't know, but our competitor has a Facebook page. Well,
Right.
do we have our own strategy?
Right. Well, the interesting thing about those conversations, though, is they can be contained within one larger area, say marketing and media, right? And what's happening, I think, now with retail media networks is it's part marketing, it's part commercial.
Hmm.
And, I'd love to know your thoughts on where should the leadership come from within the organization, because it can't just be these conversations and strategies be sorted by the media team because there's such big commercial implications, and probably vice versa. Is
Right.
it a partnership between the CMO and the chief sales or commercial person? I mean, where does this start?
Yeah. No, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The uniqueness here is the minute you get retailers involved in the situation, you're touching that sales line, right? So your absolute KPIs that pay the bills. And so I do think at a senior level there has to be these colleagues that work together and are aligned on, and I guess it makes sense. Your total business objectives should, at a very senior level, be, united, and hopefully you're incented on the same KPIs.
Hmm.
And that's a big um, problem for a lot of organizations, where imagine where even the supply chain person's KPI is very different than the salesperson's KPI. And people think that's a healthy tension. And in some cases, probably there's some line items there that are, but in general, if we're all striving toward the same thing, I think we'll do what's right for the business overall, and we keep the consumer and retailer in mind. So yes, and I think at a very senior level, there has to be this alignment on where people want to invest and what channels are important to you, what customers are important to you, where you will and won't do things. But then when you get down to like really executing it, these discussions are held at buyer, you know,
Right.
desks, and they're or marketing folks within customers whose key contact tends to be the shopper marketing group.
Right.
Every brand, and every brand manager can't have a relationship with every customer.
Oh,
It's just too.
yeah. That's a great question, and you bring up the shopper marketing bit. I mean, it feels to me at times that there's been some nervousness of shopper marketers that gosh, all the shopper marketing money and resources are going to go to retail media networks. What's my role? How should I be looking at this? When in fact, as you just described, there's probably a real opportunity for leadership from shopper marketing resources. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do you see shopper marketing people, resources, that function, if you will, being impacted by this, and what role should or could they be playing from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I've said it to some friends of mine in the industry that have done this a long time in shopper. It's probably an opportune time for rebranding, because I think the name sort of represents a little bit of the past. And I think about when I first started, and we did call it building brands with customers, because that's what it pretty much is, or through customers. We began to establish relationships with marketing departments at customers that really didn't exist before, and we started with tactics that looked quite familiar to
Mm,
what was probably happening in sort of national spends in media. So if we were doing some Dove campaign for Real Beauty, we had like a Walmart aspect to Dove campaign for Real Beauty and what have you, and we'd have events or sampling and things like that. Over time, functions like consumer promotions and such basically evaporated, and shopper marketers picked up
that's right.
couponing and, contest sweepstakes games, things that, when I was at Kraft, we had a dedicated consumer promotion group in every division, and I kind of oversaw it, across all the company. So those tactics became very shopper marketing related, and everything tended to be through retailers versus just sort of the national. And a very small group did the national things. I feel like
Hmm.
retail media is kind of headed in that same, and just because it has media in the title,
Hmm.
I get it. It doesn't mean media people, it used to be coupons. Oh, that's owned by consumer promotion. Well, no, it's the shopper marketing people mostly do that now. So this is kind of an easy, and it is very different media than, TV, radio, print, out of home, whatever, that tends to be in sort of that classic agency media model. Most shopper marketing type agencies have begun to cut their teeth on the retail media networks and understand, and you're literally negotiating with your retailer about, hey, I have my dates, my rates, my trade spend, my displays, my retail media investment. It's a holistic investment
Yeah.
profile with,
And I
so
think what
it
got
has
us.
to kind of fit in that space, because
Yeah.
otherwise you'll lose that negotiation power and requirements for performance.
And not only that, the principles. I agree with you on the branding of shopper marketing, but some of the core principles about looking at category solutions, category growth, and then winning your brand inside the category. And categories are something the retailers and the brands care about. But if you look at the evolution of retail media networks, it's more, PDP, item page, item specific, programmatic, and those routes are carrying it forward to probably not allowing shopper marketers to see the bigger opportunity of category and how it all fits, which is where I think it's a natural place. Like you said at the very beginning, it's a tactic, but it's a tactic at an item-ish level or maybe a brand
Yeah,
level. And here's an opportunity for this to evolve to get more holistically tied into the total program of what you're trying to accomplish through retailers.
right, right. Well, and it's interesting because I do think during the pandemic, I witnessed, just as a shopper, some executions of things that seemed very categorical too, where brands
Yeah.
took a lead, but there was a real consumer need for certain items and categories and ways of thinking about using products that you might not have used in a certain way before. So I do think there's a role that these, kind of certainly the networks could play across a portfolio within a manufacturer or across a category within a retailer. And that's not wildly foreign, certainly to sales folks or shopper marketing folks, but I do, that kind of seat of energy is around that commercial execution.
Mm,
Um, and you don't want to lose sight of it because it isn't, and not to say that, we'll call it top of funnel if you believe in funnels or whatever,
yeah.
or path to purchase, but not to say that, there isn't a role, traditional media, retailer media can play in that sort of top of funnel piece, but there's always that quid pro quo. I'm spending with you as a channel, as retailers or whatever, because I understand how people shop my category, my brand, and I need to engage at this piece of the journey. And that's what you're going to help me do. And at the end of it, I need to recognize some sales growth, um, you know,
Absolutely.
with you, not, without you.
Yeah, 100%. If you go back to some of the early parts of this conversation, we started with the senior leaders and what they may need to know about retail media networks. There's a lot of fog, if you put it
Yeah.
mildly, and because of the change in rapid behavior of how this is all evolving, you do get to speak to a lot of senior leaders. What were some things that you think they should know that they may be holding as like, well, that's really not the way it is? What are some things that they should understand about the current reality that they may not understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for a bit of a step back
Mm-hmm.
with an organization to say, are we prepared? Meaning, do we have the right talent, skill sets within our organization to leverage this activity that's different than it was before? So, again, I go back to, folks have been doing this for a really long time and aren't really familiar with kind of how things work. Do we have enough people in the organization to teach them? Can we upskill people? Um, I think a lot of times people, some big organizations like to throw a reorg at something
Yep.
new.
Right.
Um, and boy, we're just going to get new things faster and faster. And reorging is so painful. So are there ways to create more fluid roles in organizations? um, Maybe you outsource some stuff because that's a lot easier to change than insourcing it. So thinking about how to get the work done in different ways, I think senior leaders have to think about. They have to realize that measurement is still a huge challenge. So you don't want to be like sixth to the party. You have to kind of play the game, particularly with important
Mm-hmm.
customers to you, but you don't have to spend zillions to do it, because be careful, because that next year they're going to want to repeat that and anniversary that that
That's a
investment
great. Well,
that
there's
you
a
did.
couple of a couple of really good nuggets in there to pull out. I think one is that you know you can't just benchmark. A lot of senior leaders just benchmark what's going on with Amazon and
Yeah,
apply that model across. And Amazon is Amazon, and it's
yeah.
different. And
Pure
so
play, very different than Omni,
yeah,
for
then
sure.
Omni, and I think you got to first understand that Omni and Amazon are two different things, and not try to compare and drive those comparisons across because it'll lead you down some interesting roads. I think the other thing to know is that we're still in very early stages. I mean, the retailers are spending and moving as fast as they can to build capabilities, and it's not going to be fully functioning with all the metrics and things that you need and would want. But that so we're in an evolutionary state. I think if you were to look at today as the fixed endpoint, you would probably be making a lot of different decisions than saying, well, wait
Sure.
a minute, where's this going over the next year or two as they rapidly develop, and do I want to be part of that conversation and involved in it? So
Right.
that's the other thing. And I guess the last point I think that's really interesting is that a lot of people compare, what they're getting in metrics and data performance with a world that is probably not going to look the same in 2004 with cookieless. And so you're comparing it against, a space of what I
Correct.
can get with cookies and that level of performance data that's not going to be there in
Right.
2004 at some point.
Well, yeah, I mean, compare yourself if you have European businesses. is a very different world with GDPR and those sorts of things that have come. So, I
That's
think
right.
in the US, we're lucky. A number of the clients I work with have businesses around the world, so they can kind of compare notes. And we've had a little bit more free reign in some ways. And yes, that's going to change. And at the same time, you make the comment, which is so true. These networks coming out of even some of our biggest retailers, Walmart, Target,
Hmm.
whatever, they're still in very early stages compared to where an Amazon is today. And they're just now that's not to say understand how Amazon works. I mean, I would tell
Right.
senior leaders like understand it because there's certainly a relationship and it will be different, but there's some truths like having great product detail pages and things like
Yeah.
that is important everywhere, So um, I do think that you're right, and it's uncomfortable when things change or move at speeds, that and there are things we don't understand and whatever, but we've been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
That's a constant. Like,
Yeah. No, 100%.
buckle in. Like,
And one thing I think you said earlier that I think is so important is not to look at it as a reorg opportunity. You may need to reorg,
Yeah,
always refresh and think about that. But to do it in a time that's not, there's still some uncertainty about, how things evolve. I mean, what happens when the omni-channel retailers are really able to tie into their in-store environments, which they don't really today as much, but I think that there's innovation that's going
yeah,
to happen there eventually
yeah,
to get the foot
exactly.
traffic, right? And then now we're back to more of a commercial conversation. And
Right.
so I
Well, and
think,
if you think if you let it organically play out a little bit, I mean, I just think of when we started with the newer shopper marketing organization at Unilever when I was there, and
yep,
we really like staffed up big time.
yep,
And about a year later, I said, I was running. I'm like, you know what? This model isn't the right model. We
hmm,
need less. What we need is people inside to just understand shopper marketing. I don't need shopper marketing marketers. I need
right.
marketers. Again, it's a tactic. But I do need people facing customers and being able to be that one point of contact across 400 brands to Walmart, to, Target, to whoever, and we were relaxed about it. We're like, this is what we're going to try, and when we know something better, we will go and do that. And the organization needs to know we're being flexible and fluid,
Well,
because I do
that's,
think,
yeah.
yeah, it's going to keep changing.
And I think that's the advantage of the shopper marketing journey evolving at a slightly slower pace than what we're seeing here.
Yeah,
Because you have time to think through things and work through things. And we discovered things like, you know what, it's probably good in a brand manager's career path to take, a year or two in a customer team, right? Or into a shopper
yeah,
marketing role. It just builds that. And those awarenesses evolved. We're in a disruption space that's happening so fast.
yeah, yes,
A
yeah.
lot of those learnings haven't had a chance to percolate, which I think is making people a bit crazy.
Yeah. No, 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 it's true. And I do think, um, you know, do rely on your agency partners, to some degree, sometimes just to do the work to get through the day, but also because they work across a number of clients and platforms, they can bring you, I think, some good thinking, um, that they do day in, day out. And you typically have people that do it a part of the day, kind
Yeah.
of thing, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. But until we get, and it's going to take a long time, to really consistent metrics and such, um, it can be the wild wild west.
Yeah, and there's probably one thing that you said around anniversarying that word there, but I think if I was in a senior team or in a senior role at a CPG, I would be collecting my red lines that I want to be really careful about setting precedent on,
Yeah,
because if you make the decision that you want this conversation to be highly integrated into your JBP and see it as a trade transaction, that's very different than saying we want the incremental spends to come from a media budget. And
correct.
do you want that to be something you endeavor to spend or get committed to spend? Because
Okay.
those are two different
It's two
approaches.
different things. Yeah.
And you can get locked in really quickly.
Yeah. No, and that's why I think in kind of two layers. One is, um, thinking about spend holistically and not being so black and white, like this is for this and that's for that. Like, hey, here's what we want to invest. We want to try a little bit more on this year. And if that doesn't work out, then next year, we
Right.
may dial it back or whatever. But then this is where, Andy, as we talked about,
Hmm.
the big question is who owns, the
That's right.
budget when it has a name media in it, or is it above or below the line? How do you account for it?
Well,
And
Kelly, I mean, I've been in several share groups as well. I haven't found anybody that has that sorted out yet. And maybe you
no,
have, but it's
well,
the question of the hour.
and here's what I will say, and I think anyone who's outside of the marketing function, and I've never been a traditional marketer, will hate that I'm saying this, but when people say who owns the money, I'm like, where's the P&L sit?
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, if you have brand level P&Ls, category level P&Ls, or just a company level P&L, it tends to be a marketer that owns it.
Mm-hmm.
So they will always own it. Your job as a supporting function and a collaborative group of people is when you go knocking on the door for dollars, you better make darn sure that they are in service to the brand objective and KPIs. And in your best knowledge, because it doesn't always work out, that investment is going to be put in a place to deliver against that. And when you work with that spirit and it's really clear for people, it doesn't really matter who owns it because you all own it.
100%. And I think maybe you and I were in the same meeting when I heard this thought that alignment is far more important than ownership, clarity, or
Yeah,
accountability. Because
yeah,
even if you've got clear accountability, but you don't have alignment across the core teams, you're in just as bad shape as
100%.
not having any accountability at all. Because you can't execute that in a joined up way if you don't have alignment.
Right. No, I agree. And I would tell you that's you know, forget all the topics we've just talked about. That's the biggest problem I've found almost anywhere I work when there's lack of clarity, and which drives misalignment often because people aren't being really transparent about, or super, I can't make it clearer than this. All bets are off. Like people are off doing their functional, and I don't. Most of it's not intentional, or they're trying to like kill the business. It's just lack of clarity. People, it's amazing. People just go off and do their own thing and have their own agenda.
Yep, 100%. And then one more thing I wanted to talk about, which is I think this area of the gap between the senior leadership and perhaps people that are hands on keyboard in
Mhm.
terms of doing it every day. And one thing that I would recommend is that you try to pull together use cases, case studies of what actually you're doing if you're on the more SME and in the trenches day to day. But the good, the bad, the ugly. Because I think the best way
Yes.
to learn from a senior manager perspective is to, okay, so we started here. This is what we did. This is what happened. And this is what we learned, right? And having
Right.
fast learn, fast deploy, kind of mindset, because it's so hard to talk about this in an abstract way without being
Oh,
able to pull up and see, oh, okay, this is what happened here. And Target did it. You did this execution at Target and it was very different results. Why is that? Oh, because there's
right.
differences in algorithms. Oh, I didn't know that. Right.
Right. Well, yeah, and I mean, if you'll indulge me, I have thought of two really important thoughts
Yeah.
on that. So one is actually when we, starting shopper marketing at Unilever and taking money from trade and brands to fund it, and the whole like, what am I getting for my money,
Yep.
story. And what happened was we got very disciplined once a quarter, going back to our partners and saying, so here was our strategy, remember, for the year with these customers, whatever. Here's what we ran. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't work. Here's what we're going to do again. Here's what we're never going to do again. Here's what.
Yep.
And it became like, first of all, okay, oh, great, you're going to show us. And we ended up over time, people didn't come to the meetings anymore because they trusted us. Fine. But I said to my team, we're never going to stop these meetings, ever, ever, because we're going to constantly report on what we're doing and what we're getting, and people will, and ultimately we became a very trusted
Yeah.
organization. But the case studies you talk about, the real
Yep.
examples of what we're doing, what we're getting, and the honesty about what's working and what isn't working, very, very, very important. The other thing I just wanted to bring up, we talk about the senior leaders, and honestly, the onus is on them, because the
Yeah.
more junior hands-on people aren't going to go like, hey, CEO or CMO or whatever, you want to hear what I'm doing today? It's never going to happen. I'll tell you at Philips, it was so refreshing. Our CEO would come out to market visits, and we'd do, what's happening in store. And I was new to the organization, and he said to me, why don't we have an online in-store visit? And I'm like, what do you mean an on-store? And he goes,
Mm.
I need to know how it works. So he said, the next time I come, so we created an on-store shopping, in-store online shopping experience. It was Amazon related, huge customer for Philips. And we started with, we have a mom who's 35 years old who's looking for blah, blah, and we explained search to him and what happened, what came up, and we went through the, motion. And he was amazing and so great, and like asked all the questions in a safe spot where I don't, he's the CEO, he's not dumb, he's smarter than
No.
I am, but he doesn't know this, that, like, I don't expect him to understand the R&D stuff the way the R&D people do. And so you have to be constantly curious and inquisitive and ask, and don't be afraid, because guess what, there's nothing better when the 25-year-old goes, I know something I shared with the CEO.
Oh
Everyone
yeah.
wins.
Yeah. 100%.
Everyone wins. And I think sometimes folks are, they don't want to admit, I don't know this.
I agree with you, and I love this question that you said. I need to know how this works, and show me how this really works. And I think that's probably one question that senior leaders should be asking of the 25-year-old SMEs, or whatever age they are, on the front lines of this, because I learn something new every day. It seems like about
I do.
what can be done in the Amazon Marketing Cloud. What is that thing, and how is that different? And those, the people that know that stuff are either at the agency or they're really deep into it, and it's so refreshing to hear it. But you've got to really proactively go out and look
Well,
at
you
what's
do.
really happening.
Well, and you end, what happens is you build like a coalition of the willing, and then over time, when something bubbles up to a high level decision maker who's, why are we spending? He's like, I'll tell you why we're spending it on this, because I know that on the journey, and there they are defending you, and they can. So,
Hundred
I'm enlightened by that, because I always feel I'm a life learner, and there, it changes all the time. It's hard to stay on top of it, but you have to make a point of it. We had a discussion with
percent.
some of my agency colleagues yesterday just on this reverse mentoring idea, and everyone goes, oh yeah, they do that P&G, oh yeah, I said, but you know what happens, the appointments get canceled. It gets set up all the time, and the CEO runs out of time. And oh, what gets canceled? Reverse mentoring, learning, and
Yep.
that shouldn't be canceled.
No,
Like that,
not at
that
all.
meeting needs to happen, or finding ways, to do it that aren't always self-serve. Just set some time aside, but really have experts. And I was blessed. I have had teams that were so skilled in these spaces and taught me more than I could ever teach them, ever. And they know
Yeah.
who they are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent. One of the things I found helpful when I was trying to bring some change to ASDA in a retail environment was grabbing a more junior finance person and taking them on that journey with me and saying, you know what, some of these things we don't know how to measure.
Mm,
Help us figure this out, because what everyone knows is eventually it's going to end up, are we going to finance this? What's the business case? And if finance is the last to engage, and they're not educated along the journey of how this works,
100%.
you're going to have a real challenge with the CFO. And I think, bringing in more junior, finance folks that can partner with the shopper marketers or the media
Yeah.
people is such an unlock for
Yeah.
helping
No,
build the
I love
case.
that. I love that, because I would tell you, in particular when I was at Unilever, the finance people were my lifeline.
Yeah,
And they really, if you can partner with them, because honestly, they know how the innards work,
that's right.
um, of the organization, and they can say, what if we did this way or thought about it? I'm like, wow. I think that's a great call out.
Well, especially with the KPIs where they are, because I don't think they've matured enough to know what affects what. And so I would
Right.
get marketing dashboards that was looking at brand saliency and cut through and then all these other factors with it. And, one metric, if you really dialed into that as a siloed group, you could drive it hard. But then
Yeah.
all of a sudden, other things bad would start to happen because you were fixated on that KPI. And
Yeah.
ROAS is a good example, right? I mean, you can juice ROAS by just by branded keywords and such, but that doesn't mean you're going to grow your business.
Right. People are like, well, why aren't we selling more? And and people can manipulate data. Of course,
Yep.
we can come up with any story you want to tell. And so that's why it takes a village. It takes real alignment, I think, cross functionally for people to understand all these nuances. And I will say, despite the fact I spent most of my career sort of on the sales side and with customers, um, most of my partners in crime that were not on that same playing field with me with the customers understood the impact if things didn't go well with customers. And because that's, the rubber does meet the road there. And we're willing to be creative and find ways to really think through, try things, experiment, and that's what it takes. This is a space that you really do need to partner up. Don't try and be like, I'm just going to do this over here and I'll keep you posted on what happens.
No.
um, that's a big mistake, because I think over time it's just going to be it's the when you said what are people talking about, it's all people are talking about.
Yeah. And I
Keeping
think there's
your bushel barrel isn't good.
Yeah, and I think the companies that are starting to, I think, take a more strategic approach than taking a reactive or isolating pieces off or whatever, a reactive approach, are starting to step back and say, okay, we need a strategic approach here on how we're going to transition to this space and what does it mean? How are we going to segment customers to where we invest and where to play and where to win, right? How are we
Yeah,
going to
well, I
assess?
brought that up because that's on my mind, is when you strategically, it isn't just like, oh, we want to grow 10% as a total company or whatever. It's like, but where and
Right.
how? And that's it. If you don't have a solid customer segmentation strategy, that's a miss.
That's right, 100%. And I think you need that. There's 44 retail media networks active in the U.S. alone. Some of studies said there's 600 of them out there. I don't know, but I mean, you cannot invest the same across 44 networks. You just can't master the complexity. There's no way. What kind of
Yeah.
customer data strategy do you have? Do you need to buy insights from every single retail media network? Is that going to be accretive and new? Are you going to get new learnings, or are you going to start
Right.
duplicating? And so I do think it's like, look, you may not be in a great place today, but at least get a plan, right? And get a plan that
Right.
looks out to the future.
Well, and I think it helps in discussions with the retailers too, because you go, here's what we're about. And if they're not meeting some sort of standard that's in your vision, maybe they'll strive for it. You say,
Hmm.
listen, we can't invest without XYZ. And they're like, well, we don't do that. And you're like, well, that's why I can't.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
maybe could we try X, or could we, and that I think it gives you a foundation to stand on and be unified as one voice back to the retailer as as a manufacturer. Because look at what's happened. We've become buyers,
Yeah. 100%.
not sellers.
Well, I often don't put my defend the retailer hat on as often as I probably should, but coming from that in the most recent corporate world, think about it from a retailer's perspective. How many different brands are coming with different expectations? Because
Very true.
there's no standards on that front either. And so
You're right.
just like
Yeah, you're
there's,
right.
every retailer is different, and so's every brand. And I think if
You
we
all can't have the Christmas ad, and you all can't have,
right,
or whatever. you know,
right,
yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Well,
So
and they, I hope, in the same way, they have a bit of a segmentation strategy too.
sure,
Like that, we're going to grow these categories, and these players are going to be instrumental in that,
yep,
and that's where we're going to, and
yep.
so that's where obviously, JBP and all that, and we all can't be all things to everybody, but I think there's enough room out there
Yes.
between retailers, brands, platforms, whatever, that everybody can come up with a compelling enough strategy that can work.
Excellent. Well, we've covered a lot of ground for this very complex and broad topic. Is there anything else before we wrap up that you would want to maybe communicate to senior leaders that are responsible for these spaces at bigger CPG companies or midsize?
Yeah, I mean, I've probably articulated it already, but I would say you've got to dig in, and learn this yourselves, because and again, not hands on keyboard. Maybe sit next to somebody hands on keyboard.
Yep.
Um, and it isn't, months and months. It's take a couple days for a couple months, and dig in, especially as you're writing your strategic plan over the next year and 3 to 5 years. And when there's a section in it, no doubt, about digital investment or investment, ask questions. And you don't have to preface it, but if it makes you feel better, preface it to, I don't know this well. Speak to me in common language
Yep.
that I can understand, because that's the worst, when people kind of use and you're like, wait, step back. But I do think I do think a lot lies with the senior leaders. And then I'd say again, because I can't say it enough, having, and you have it too, Andy, kids working in this space as senior leaders, teach them the fundamentals
Yep.
and how the business should work, so that they can make the connection of what their hands on keyboard does to driving the overall business results.
Yeah, well said. And not only the business results, but make sure they understand what are brand objectives, marketing objectives. It is
Exactly.
right.
They don't come and learn. And I mean, I think we lost 2 good years in the pandemic to really mentor people in this space and
Yes.
teach them. And you talk about, when I first started, marketers would come out and work for 6 to 8 weeks, live in the field and work with salespeople to do resets and
Yep.
understand how to read a planogram and go to store and call on. And then people were like, oh, that's a waste of money. We don't need to do that anymore. And it doesn't happen. I think it was the best use of
Oh, sure.
money and time of those people back then. And honestly, many of them are my friends and are CEOs of companies and do wonderful jobs because they had that time.
Yep.
And same thing. I had to go to headquarters as a salesperson and learn sales planning and work with
Right.
marketing teams so that I could grow in my career. And I
Yep.
think that's a gap. So if you get time to have someone teach you, and you can teach them something, we're all going to win. I think.
Yeah. Excellent. And I'd say maybe get involved in some industry share groups where you could talk to your peers and learn, because I think you'll find some enlightenment there that everyone's pretty much in the same spot today.
Misery loves company. I mean, it makes.
I didn't want to say it that way, but yes.
I'm teasing. But no, I mean, I think when you can talk about it and be like, oh my God, I thought that was just us, or I thought,
Right.
And without divulging anything,
Yep.
certainly you're going to be careful about that. But there are things like, I didn't think of that, and
That's right.
we get the chance to do it, working where I work and where you work. But when you're working in a company and you're not in a share group, you don't have a lot of opportunities. So that is
No.
a really good, and read everything you can, and that comes along, and join some of those lovely emails that come out and teach you new things.
Well, and Kelly, if anybody wants to reach out to you and get a hold of you, we can put your links obviously in the notes. But what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, I think just an email is great if you want to send, share that. I'm pretty receptive to email.
Excellent.
So happy to chat further. This was really fun, Andy.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to get a deep conversation with a fellow journeyer in the shopper marketing commercial space. And so lovely to see you again today. And let's keep the conversations going.
Yes, please.
That's it for this episode of It's a Customer's World. If you found this helpful and entertaining, I would be so grateful if you could share our show with your friends, and I'd be super happy if you subscribe so you can be updated as we publish new episodes. And if you really want to help, leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. It's a Customer's World podcast is a product of the University of Arkansas's Customer-Centric Leadership Initiative and a Walton College original production.